Mr. Taylor, I have a series of questions from the recognised legal representatives, so they cover several of the themes, so they may feel a little bit scattergun.
Okay.
First of all, when you first arrived at the Society in 1985, what established relationships did the Society have with non-haemophilia clinicians? For example, hepatologists or virologists?
Probably very few, I think, is my recollection, because up until that time it hadn't really been an issue, as it were. So, but I don't recall that there were, particularly at that point, strong relationships. As the HIV, the impact of the HIV epidemic became more apparent, then they did have, they did develop relationships. So, for example, I recall, I think it was either in 1985 or 1986 at the annual general meeting, the Society invited Dr. Richard Tedder, who was the leading epidemiologist in HIV, to come and give a talk. So they did develop as things progressed.
And with the benefit of hindsight, could an independent medical review from non-haemophilia clinicians, should it have been sought sooner?
Possibly with hindsight, but again, it's always easy to look at things in hindsight.
In relation to the medical advisory panel, were you aware, or was the committee aware, that several of the members of the MAP were instructed by the defendant as expert witnesses in the HIV litigation?
I was not aware of that. And I don't know whether the rest of the committee were aware of that.
So you don't recall any discussion about any possible conflicts of interest in that regard?
No.
In relation to the decision to openly say to government that there was poor prospects of success on litigation in relation to HIV, who made that tactical decision to say that?
I would think it was probably a consensus decision to make it clear to the government that they were effectively, as I said, being disingenuous in proposing a path of action which was not going to succeed in providing help and support on an immediate basis to people who urgently needed help and support.
When we were discussing the HIV litigation, we discussed whether the concerns about supply of concentrates influenced the Society's position on litigation. Could we look at HSOC 0029476_061, please? And could we go to page 3? At the top of the page, compensation claims, we see the World Federation of Haemophilia has also circulated a paper advising against the pursuit of compensation claims. This resolution had its base in the United States, where it was feared that actions brought against individual pharmaceutical companies could lead to a drying up of the concentrate supply. Since it was felt that action against companies in the UK was only one option, and perhaps the least likely to succeed, it was suggested that we should reserve our position by voting against the resolution. This was proposed by Mr. Taylor, seconded by Mr. Knight, and agreed unanimously. Do you recall this meeting and this resolution?
Not specifically, but I think it goes to show that we didn't allow the possibility of said drying up or litigation against companies. We kept that option open, and we voted against this resolution in order to keep that option open. And I don't recall that the, quote, drying up of supply was a contributory factor in our decision making.
This morning we discussed 2 letters from Dr. Hay and Professor Preston about hepatitis C. if we could have HSOC. Sorry, I've got a different reference. Give me one moment. HSOC 303297. Yes. Sorry. And if we could turn to page 4 of the document, please. When we spoke about whether there was a difference between Dr. Hay and Professor Preston, you said that your interpretation, your understanding, was that the chronic liver disease need not necessarily cause problems, and that there wasn't, in fact, a difference between the two letters. If you look at the first paragraph of this letter in the middle, it says the patients are therefore usually unaware that they have liver disease. The majority of these patients, if biopsied, have been shown to have chronic persistent hepatitis, a mild and usually non-progressive form of liver disease, unlikely to give problems. Is that where your understanding came from?
Yes.
We can take that down. Thank you, Shumik. I have a few questions now about the hepatitis campaign. We spoke about the Macfarlane Trust and the need to maintain a good relationship with the government in relation to future funding. To what extent was the Society's decision not to advance a hepatitis C campaign in the early 90s based on a desire not to jeopardise continued funding for the HIV population?
I have absolutely no recollection that was an issue in our thinking at all.
And within the hepatitis campaign, was the focus solely in the 90s on hepatitis C, or was consideration given to those with chronic hepatitis B?
It was totally focused on hepatitis C. Again, hepatitis B was a known issue amongst the recipients of blood products and had been for decades. And however, my recollection is that it wasn't again felt to be of the same order of a problem as, let alone HIV or hepatitis C.
In relation to the hepatitis C litigation and the legal advice, in your witness statement, you've discussed the legal advice that had been received by the Society and by various legal firms. And you've said that the advice received by those groups was in many cases contradictory. What do you mean by that? What was contradictory?
There's a specific example, I think in 1986 in Bulletin, where we actually had a piece by two solicitors, firms representing people who were litigating, which gave directly opposing views on the prospects of success. So that is what I meant.
Do you mean 1986?
No, 1996 for hepatitis.
It's gone down as 1986 in the transcript, which is how I heard it. So I thought you meant 96.
Sorry. Definitely 96.
I'm sorry, I heard it as 96, but that's fine. We've corrected the transcript. It should
we're
be 96.
like the two solicitors then, aren't we?
In relation to both the HIV and the hepatitis C campaign, you've described it as being a moral case rather than a legal case. Can you explain what you mean by that?
The root cause of the reason we're all here today is that I and the society has always believed that it was a failure in government policy. Dr. David Owen made the commitment and has given evidence to this inquiry. He made the commitment in the mid-1970s, and as a physician himself, he recognized the dangers and problems of the blood supply that was coming from the United States, and I think that was a key motive. Well, I know that was a key motivation of him making that policy in discussions I've had with him. And it was that consistent failure over many years by governments of varying different colours to implement that promise, which, if implemented, might not have eliminated all of the problems that we've had to deal with, would have vastly mitigated those the number of people infected and affected by a considerable amount. And so, consequently, we believed that the government of the day, or all governments, had a moral responsibility to redress the failure to implement that government policy.
And you've spoken about the campaigns that the society was running, and you've said that there were competing demands on resources of the society. Could you just briefly explain what those demands were?
Well, we still had, during the 1980s, or from when I was involved, 1985 through to the early 90s in particular, you had, on the one hand, you had hysterical media coverage about HIV, which seriously impacted virtually all of our members in some way or another, because, as I think I've already mentioned, haemophilia became a marker for HIV. And so you had people, as I said, children who were being discriminated at school, people whose job prospects were being put under threat, their homes were vandalized. And so we were dealing as a society with a flood of requests for help and support coming in. So we had that. We had the increasing call for campaigning, something which the society had not done previously, and had to get up to speed and learn new tricks, as it were, in terms of campaigning from about 1985, 1986 onwards. And at the same time, we had to deal with what I would describe as business as usual, which was dealing with and supporting people, young families in particular, with haemophilia, with children. And so we had all of this happening at the same time with a very small staff and volunteer trustees and a very limited financial income, as it were. So those were some of the factors which were competing at all times for attention and resources.
I'm just going to check behind you. So those are the questions.
I've just got one question to ask. It's I don't think I've ever in my career yet had a case in which it has been known that one side has said in an open document to the other side, our legal advice says we're going to fail. Why was it that the society said that they had had advice, i.e. legal advice, to that effect, rather than simply saying, because the point is the same, there were various difficulties in the way of pursuing a legal case. You didn't need to enumerate them. They might have been obvious at the time. In the laws it was at the time. But would that not have done the job? To simply, why is it necessary to mention the fact you'd had legal advice as opposed to You appreciated there were various difficulties in the path. You might overcome them, you might not, but there were difficulties in the path of pursuing compensation.
I think there are two things. One is, I think that, first of all, the fact that we had had legal advice was in the public domain, because we had told our members had asked us to get legal advice. We sought legal advice, and we told our members what the legal advice was. So first of all, it was already in the public domain. I think the second point is that, as I think I said earlier, was we believe that the government felt that for them, trying to push us into pursuing a legal option was for them the easy way out, because they knew that it would take a long time and might not succeed. And a lot of our stakeholders or key people that we were dealing with, people like MPs, when we were seeking their support, would say, well, can you not go for redress in the courts? And so it was important to be able to explain to them that, yes, we could go to the courts. However, as you say, the prospects were uncertain. The advice that we had had was that that might not succeed, or if it would succeed, again, it would not be in a timely manner to help the people who were in urgent need. And therefore, please, Mr. or Mrs. MP, would you support us with this moral political campaign? I don't know if that helps.
Well, it does indeed. That's all that I ask. Thank you very much.
Mr. Taylor, is there anything else you would like to add?
I've got a brief statement, if that's all right. I just wanted to say, first of all, how much I welcome this inquiry. Decades late, and too late for so many friends and colleagues, but I really very much welcome this inquiry. It's in the nature of an inquiry such as this that it focuses on what went wrong. But we must not forget the huge amount of good that the Society did during this really very, very difficult time, supporting our members and campaigning on behalf of our community. The trustees were all volunteers from the haemophilia community, in many cases were individuals who were ill with or dying from HIV or hepatitis C, whilst they still campaigned for those infected and affected. The background public climate of stigma and fear towards HIV in the 1980s and 90s placed huge additional pressures on the Society, its trustees, and all of us publicly campaigning on behalf of people with haemophilia. The external environment, as I have said, was extremely fearful and hostile to anyone with HIV or AIDS. Having haemophilia became a marker for AIDS, and we had members who lost their jobs, children stigmatized at school, families whose homes were vandalized. The staff of the Society, particularly David Waters, moved mountains to help in individual cases such as these. HIV and hepatitis C were new and emerging threats that were poorly understood for many years, particularly in the case of hepatitis C. As is frequently the case with emerging threats, the scientific and medical advice was frequently confusing, conflicting, incomplete, and with hindsight, some of it was incorrect. But I'd like to believe that we always acted in the utmost good faith. The Society and the great majority of our members did not believe that, for the most part, haemophilia clinicians were negligent. Time and time again, we were told that individuals did not want to take legal action against their doctors. By and large, haemophilia clinicians cared deeply about their patients and acted in good faith in their treatment. Accordingly, the focus for Society's campaigns was always to persuade government to meet its moral responsibility for its negligent behaviour. I and the Society have always been convinced that the root cause of the disaster, and in particular its scale, were the inherently unsafe practices and processes connected with paid blood and plasma collection in the US and elsewhere in the 1970s. It was a risk recognised by the UK government and by Dr. David Owen as Health Minister, when he made the commitment to UK self-sufficiency in 1975. It was then the failure of successive UK governments to implement this commitment that led to the prolonged reliance on imported blood products that in turn infected so many of us with HIV and hepatitis C. Whilst much of the focus of the inquiry to date has been on the actions of medical professionals and now on the society and other campaigners in due course, I believe that most of us, whose lives were devastated, will be focusing on the evidence from government that is yet to come as to why self-sufficiency was not introduced when it had been promised, and why they were content to place the safety of British lives in the hands of foreign companies who had a proven record of playing fast and loose with product safety. Individuals on the trustee board itself were living under the personal pressures of living with haemophilia, HIV and hepatitis. No one could seriously suggest that the trustees were not taking the issue seriously when so many of our own members were infected, and we were working alongside friends and colleagues who we watched become ill and die, knowing that this same fate awaited ourselves. During my time on the executive committee, at least 6 of my trustee colleagues died from HIV, and personally, another 6 of my friends from school also died. I would contend that for such a small charity, whilst the outcomes of our campaigns remain unfulfilled to this day, what was achieved was truly remarkable and is a testament to the staff and volunteers involved. And my thanks goes to all those over the years who have kept this issue alive. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You have filled in some of the gaps for us that we had. In particular, evidence covering the campaign which the Haemophilia Society ran successfully for getting some money, at any rate, out of government. The story of the birth of the campaign in respect of hepatitis C, and generally you've illuminated other evidence we've already heard, but you've illuminated it further in respect to the Macfarlane Trust. So I'd just like to thank you for giving the clear evidence you have, despite what you said at the start would be a gap in your memory in the 1990s. It doesn't seem to have affected you very much, and I'm very pleased about that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Tomorrow.
So tomorrow, the inquiry will hear from Ms. Karen Pappenheim. I think she will be remote.
She'll be remote. So tomorrow, 10 o'clock, to be heard remotely, obviously screened here for those who are here.